My name is Marion Fourcade, and I am a director of Social Science Matrix. And I am pleased to welcome you to our panel today, The New Authoritarians, co-sponsored by the Institute of International Studies. We are at UC Berkeley. For those of you who are new to Matrix, we are a cross-disciplinary social science research institute at UC Berkeley. And today's event is part of our Matrix On Point series, a series devoted to panel discussions on important matters of the moment. Now we have a few upcoming attractions. Next week, actually this week, we have a panel on the economic consequences of COVID-19. This will be on Thursday. And then next week, we will have our last Matrix On Point event of the semester, and it will be on climate migration. Now, before we get started, let me review some essential housekeeping items. So this is a webinar, so please make sure to submit your questions through the Q&A feature and not via the chat window. The chat window we will use for troubleshooting technical issues. So if you are having any AV trouble and would like assistance, please send us a message in the chat and we will try to offer you support. Also, please note that today's event is being recorded and we will post a video on our website, probably very shortly. And now let me introduce the moderator of today's panel. So Paul Pierson is the John Gross Professor of Political Science at UC Berkeley. Paul's teaching and research includes the fields of American politics and public policy, comparative political economy, and social theory. An amazingly productive scholar, he's the author of 6 books, including 4 co-authored with Jacob Hacker. I will just mention the 2 most recent ones, Let Them in Tweets, which just came out, How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality, and American Amnesia, How the War on Government Led Us to Forget What Made America Prosper. Both are with Jacob Hacker. Paul is also an active commentator on public affairs, and his writings have recently appeared in such outlets as the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, and the New Republic. So now, without further ado, I turn over to Professor Pierson for an opening statement and for the panelists' introductions.
Thank you, Marion. It's my pleasure to moderate this amazing panel for this Matrix On Point webinar. And the panel, again, is entitled The New Authoritarians. A new generation of authoritarians has arisen to power in democracies around the world. Since coming to office, these rulers have manipulated laws and reconfigured state bureaucracies, undermining civil liberties, flouting representative institutions, attacking the free press, and subverting international law. Figures like Bolsonaro in Brazil, Erdoğan in Turkey, Orbán in Hungary, Modi in India, and Donald Trump in the United States have all attained office by embracing and in some instances co-opting conservative populist movements. This panel will consider not only the illiberal tactics these right-wing autocrats have used to consolidate power and further their objectives, but also what it will take to undo the damage they have inflicted upon democratic institutions. Now I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists, and I'll introduce them all in the order in which they're going to speak before handing the floor over, and we'll have the 4 presentations consecutively and then open things up for conversation. Kim Lane Scheppele is the Laurance S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton University. Scheppele's work focuses on the intersection of constitutional and international law, particularly in constitutional systems under stress. In recent years, she has focused on backsliding democracies, legalistic autocracy, and challenges to the rule of law. Scheppele is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the International Academy of Comparative Law. Lena Lavinas is Professor of Welfare Economics at the Institute of Economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, as well as a senior researcher at the Brazilian National Research Council. She has served as a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study. She is the author of Takeover of Social Policy by Financialization, the Brazilian Paradox, which critically addresses the model of social inclusion that prevailed in Brazil under the rule of the Workers' Party from the early 2000s until 2016. Ashutosh Varshney is the Saul Goldman Professor of International Studies and the Social Sciences and Professor of Political Science at Brown University, where he also directs the Center for Contemporary South Asia. His books include Battles Half Won, India's Improbable Democracy, Collective Violence in Indonesia, Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life, Hindus and Muslims in India, India in the Era of Economic Reforms, and Democracy Development in the Countryside, Urban-Rural Struggles in India. Professor Varshney has also served as an advisor to the World Bank, UNDP, and the Club of Madrid. His awards include the Guggenheim and Carnegie Fellowships and the Gregory Lubert Prize. Finally, Cihan Tuğal is Professor of Sociology at UC Berkeley. His research interests include political sociology, social movements, Islam in the Middle East, social theory, religion, culture, global and transnational sociology, economic sociology and development, and comparative and historical sociology. Tuğal's most recent book, Caring for the Poor, Islamic and Christian Benevolence in a Liberal World, examines the emergence, globalization, and decline of liberal ethics by focusing on charity, philanthropy, and welfare. It's a wonderful panel, and it's my pleasure to introduce first Professor Scheppele, who will start us off.
Thanks so much, and I hope you can see my slides. I'm going to actually try to make a case for why these new authoritarians are actually not primarily, or their attraction actually is not primarily due to populism. And I can tell from our pre-panel discussion that this is going to be a controversial subject, so let me get going. So first, as the introduction indicated, these new autocrats or these new authoritarians are appearing worldwide. This is just a kind of rogues gallery of some of them, but it's kind of an interesting phenomenon that so many of these things are happening at once, and that's what I want to try to explain. This is from the VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy project, which has shown that this is not just a small phenomenon, that now about a third of the world's population is living in countries that are moving in an autocratic direction from a more democratic direction before. So this is we can all think of the countries where it's gone the farthest, but it's a tendency that's happening in a lot of places. This is another chart, and the way to read this one, another Varieties of Democracy chart, is that they're plotting the liberal democracy scores of different countries from 2009 against the horizontal axis, against the 2019 scores against the vertical axis. And the thing that's neat about the chart is that all the countries that fall above the line have improved in their liberal democracy scores over the last decade, and the ones below have been declining. And so one thing you could see is that there's just a lot more countries below the line. But the interesting set, it seems to me, are the ones in that started off sort of in the top half of these liberal democracy scores and that have really been pulling back. These were countries that we thought of as mostly consolidated, or at least semi-consolidated democracies, that have now actually regressed. And so it's that set of countries that I focus on in my work. So the question is why all this is happening. And of course, the standard explanation, and you can see it in any bookstore, assuming you have a physical bookstore that you can go into, but even virtual bookstores will tell you that most people think the answer is populism. And the arguments go something like this, that most of these new autocrats are actually elected. So the question is, what makes people elect them? And the answers are things like economic dislocation, people who are left behind, fake news, fear of the other, anger at old elites, or just plain old racism. And these are circulating in the popular press, but they're also circulating in the academic literature. And I really want to question whether populism is the thing that's driving democratic decline. And to see that, I think it's really important to distinguish what I call populist ideology, which is sort of what leaders say, the toxic stuff that comes out of their mouth, basically, and what they do. Because I think that populist ideology, which my colleague Jan Werner Müller has mostly described as sort of promoting a kind of intolerance or a fear of pluralism, that is really a separate thing from declining democracy. And what happens in declining democracies? It's the removal of checks and balances, particularly checks on executive power. And it's also a kind of capture of independent institutions or capture of the referees, as Levitsky and Zyblatt would say. And those are two different processes. And I want to argue that they actually kind of come apart. And that in particular, they come apart and in such a way that you can't actually blame democratic decline on populist ideology, in the sense that voters may come for the ideology, but they're actually not in favor of the democratic decline. And that's why I think that you can't assume that voters are voting to crash their constitutional systems. Now, how does this work? Now, here's some data from the Pew Global Attitude Survey. And I picked the data from 2016 because that was the year that Donald Trump came to power. And these are answers, comparatively across the countries listed to the question, do you think that having an increasing number of people of many different races, ethnic groups, and nationalities in our country makes it a better place to live, a worse place to live, or doesn't make much difference? And so if one of the things that populism is this kind of intolerance of pluralism, then it's the bars in orange that ought to worry you. That's where the intolerance is. And in some cases, it's the obvious players like Hungary, which we know is in trouble, and Poland. But the Netherlands is kind of in there too. Italy certainly has had a resurgence, but Germany is way more populist than the US, if that's what you take to be kind of the measure, right? What's interesting is when you look at this chart, which does show that there actually are quite a few people in a lot of different established democracies that are worried about pluralism. You compare it with this chart. This is from the next year's survey. They unfortunately didn't ask those questions in the same round, but it's the same countries. And this is a question that actually measures population's tolerance for what we might think of as authoritarianism, right? Would a system in which a strong leader can make decisions without interference from parliament or the courts be a good or bad way of governing the country? And the green here are the autocrats. And what you see is that there's just not much support for autocracy, including in the countries where we find it, right? So if you take Hungary, for example, so a quarter may be too many, but that's not a functioning democratic majority to elect candidates. In Poland, it's even less. Now this is from 2017, but this is the year that Poland elects an authoritarian government, right? So what you see when you ask people directly about autocracy is that people may be in favor of populist messages, but they're not carrying it over. There's a big distinction between that and support for autocracy. So then the question is, so maybe we're looking in the wrong place. Populism sort of blames the voters, right? So maybe we should dissolve the electorate and elect another, as Brecht famously said. So are voters really to blame for this? And this is where what I've been trying to do in my work is to go back to what I think of as the pivotal elections, the first time an autocrat comes to power, and to look at what the voters would have known at the time they first elected the autocrat. What did they know about the candidates? What choices did they have? And what really were they voting for? Were they voting for substantive populism or for constitutional destruction? So in Hungary, the country I work in, and I can see we have regional expertise on the panel, so I'm going to stick with Europe, but I would love to hear what everybody else thinks about this argument. In 2010, that was the year that Hungary elected Viktor Orbán, and he hasn't left power since, and he won't voluntarily. But in the Pew Global Attitude Survey from that year, it turns out that Hungarians were really fed up with democracy. And they were fed up with everything else, actually. And Hungarians are in general kind of fed up with things. But this was like an unusually bad year, even for Hungarians. But this was because Hungary was hit by the global financial crisis in 2010. The IMF had come in, put in an austerity program and a caretaker government. Things were actually objectively terrible. So it wasn't crazy to be dissatisfied with democracy. But in that same survey, when people in Eastern Europe were asked, how important are democratic institutions and freedoms? You can see that the Hungarians score way above even all the other countries in the region. And they all are in favor of a fair judiciary, multi-party elections, free media, free religion, overwhelming majorities, civilian control of the military. That's a weird blip, but the basic institutional independence indicators. Hungarians are all showing that they're in favor of it at the same time that they're fed up with democracy. So then what happens? So in 2010, Viktor Orbán is elected against the background of this terrible financial crisis, an austerity program, and a caretaker government. But when you look at his speeches and when you look at how he campaigned in 2010, he was campaigning against austerity and against corruption. And there's no doubt that the prior government that was dominated by the Socialist Party had been massively corrupt. And in fact, Orbán had been prime minister before from 1998 to 2002. And, he was conservative, but he wasn't crazy. So he's running in a campaign. He never says when he's campaigning that he will rewrite the Constitution, seize power, like none of that, not a hint of it. And you wouldn't have guessed it if you'd only seen the way he governed in the prior time he was prime minister. And if you look at the other choices that were running with Orbán at the same time, there were the socialists who had just crashed the economy. So it was pretty evident they weren't going to win. There was a tiny untested party called LMP, Lehet Másra Politika, which means politics can be different. Nobody knew who they were or what they stood for. And then there was the neo-Nazi party, Jobbik. So if you're voting and those are your four choices, what's the rational thing to do? And I keep telling people, even though I knew Viktor Orbán and sort of could guess where he was going to go, Orbán was the rational choice in that election. You don't have to be an anti-constitutionalist populist to think that Orbán was the reasonable choice. So did voters vote populist? I actually don't think so. So let me just show you, though, what happens as soon as Orbán starts to show that he's destroying constitutional democracy. Now, I know this is a chart in Hungarian, but orange is the line that represents popularity of Fidesz, the governing party, which is Orbán's party. And you can, if you look at the chart over here, Orbán's popularity ratings are slightly under where Trump's have been all the way along. He's never had majority support. Okay, it's a multi-party system though, so you can win with plurality support. So he comes to power in 2010, and almost as soon as he grabs power, he starts crashing the constitutional system. He introduces a new constitution. He starts capturing institutions. He goes after the constitutional court. And the whole time he's engaged in that constitutional destruction, his popularity drops to the point where it drops below 20%. This is not support for constitutional destruction or what we think of as autocracy, right? So what happens? He realizes he needs to kind of get out of a bind. So this is when he turns what we think of now as populist, right? This is when he starts blaming George Soros for everything. This is when he starts blaming migrants before they show up. This is when he starts, invoking Hungarian constitutional history, and his popularity goes up, which is to say, in the Hungarian case, you can see really clearly that there's a real separation between constitutional destruction and populist rhetoric. You might ask what this political party is that does better than Orbán most of the time, that's here in gray. That's the party of don't know and no opinion, which tells me that part of what's happening in Hungary is that there is no party that satisfies what most people are looking for, actually. And so I'm going to come back to this question about party formation in a minute. So then the question is, could the onset of autocracy have been predicted by Hungarian voters in 2010? And I want to say, A, it couldn't have been predicted by most. B, as soon as they saw it happening, the bottom fell out of Orbán's popularity. And only when he turns populist, like where the rhetoric starts to convey a different impression, does he become more popular again. But those two are really quite different moments. The voters, on the other hand, are showing a pretty strong commitment to constitutional government. Okay, so then the question, I have a lot of other case studies in this book, and including cases that people on this panel know more about. So that's why I'm really eager to hear everybody's views. So let me just say something quickly about why I think this is happening in a more general context, because a lot of governments are becoming problematic at the same time. And I think if you look behind all of these autocratic leaders, what precedes them is a decline, collapse, splintering, or trouble in the party system before they come to power. And voters face choices in the elections where they elect the autocrat. They either face a situation where they hate all the candidates, or there's been one party in power so long it's just been discredited, so they vote for the other guys, or there just aren't very many good choices. And so, sorry, my phone is ringing. This is what happens when you Zoom from home. So I'm just going to, again, focus on Europe and to say, You know, parties have been in decline for a long time, and this is a subject of a lot of political science research. The chart on the left just shows you the percentage of party membership in a variety of different European democracies, and the general answer is it's all going down. The chart on the right shows you in blue the share of the vote received by the winning party in parliamentary elections all across Europe, and the brown line shows you the number of parties receiving more than 1% of the vote. What you see happening in democracies all over the place is that the winning parties are declining, or just traditional parties are declining, and the number of parties, splinter parties, is going up. This is because a lot of different things are going wrong with parties. I won't do this right now because time is short. But what I'm suggesting is that you can actually get rogue leaders without rogue voters. And part of this is that when parties become weak and when parties start to splinter and fail, they fail to exclude the dangerous candidates who will become autocrats. Or worse yet, you start getting these freelance parties that spring up with some charismatic figure at the top who has nobody constraining or vetting who the candidates are. And so I think normal elections can bring about broken party systems. And I'll close with this thought. So why are traditional parties collapsing? And this is where I'm piggybacking off a lot of the good work that's been done by Pippa Norris and Ron Inglehart. What we've been seeing for a long time is the emergence of an axis of political identification. They call it populist to cosmopolitan liberalism. I call it nationalist to cosmopolitan liberalism. But sort of from the folks who really focus on a national framework versus those who think of themselves as famously was called citizens from nowhere, but people who identify with more universal values. That axis is actually tearing apart parties on the left, and it's also tearing apart parties on the right, because parties of the left have both factions in them, parties on the right have both factions in them, and you start seeing civil wars between the nationalist and cosmopolitan factions within parties of the left and parties of the right. And this has been tearing them apart. And what you see is that party collapse or party chaos precedes democratic collapse, exactly. And so my last slide is that I don't think people are voting against constitutional democracy and for autocracy. You can't blame democratic decline on populism. It's party weakness that leads to not vetting candidates, that leads to democratic decline, and that's it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Professor Scheppele. And our next speaker is Professor Lavinas.
So hi, everyone. It's a joy to be here participating in this seminar about the new authoritarians with you and reuniting with Marion Fourcade, for whom I have a great fondness. So thank you so much for the invitation. Given the short amount of time, I decided not to present a PowerPoint presentation because it takes a lot of time and I speak a lot when I have beautiful slides to show. So I decided to write a small piece that I sent to all of you. And what I'm going to do now is try to focus on Brazil. Of course, I could have focused on Latin America. I've written a lot on populism in Latin America, classic populism, and pink tide populism also during the 2000s with Ecuador, Bolivia. So we have a long tradition of right-wing and left-wing populism in Latin America. But I decided to focus on what is going on in Brazil. We had elections yesterday, very important municipal elections, and I would like to bring you kind of a snapshot of what is going on in Brazil and how we got where we are now with Bolsonaro. So to start off, it bears remembering that in Brazil, authoritarian roots date back to colonial times. Brazil was the country in the Americas that received the most enslaved Africans, and it was the last to abolish slavery in 1888 on the eve of the declaration of the Republic. The Republic was a military coup against the monarchy in 1889. That is where the myth of the army as the modernizing agent of Brazil responsible for the defense of Western values, family, homeland, and Christianity, and whose duty is to intervene in times of crisis originates. The armed forces have since become the greatest symbol of the homeland and are seen as the bastion against corruption. The 1988 Constitution sealed the transition to democracy after 21 years of military rule. It should be emphasized that one of the flaws of the Citizen Constitution was to grant autonomy to the armed forces to define issues of their interest. This flaw was not a neglect, but rather the sign of the armed forces' hegemony in the transition to democracy. This hegemony translated into the 1979 amnesty law, preventing the trial of all sorts of crimes, including executions committed by the dictatorship. In the name of law and order, since then, and paradoxically during the democratic rule, the process of militarization of Brazilian society and politics has constantly grown, renurturing its authoritarian strain. Its most vicious facet can be seen in the militarization of the police and in the formation of far-right militias and paramilitary groups that control large parts of metropolitan regions in Brazil. Two recent indicators reflect this trend of militarization in Brazilian politics. The first deals with the rates of political violence against candidates in the 2020 elections, 5 times higher than in 2016. This shows that the case of Councilwoman Marielle Franco, executed 2 years ago, was not an exception. According to Brazil Federal Elections Court, between January and November of this year, 85 candidates for municipal office were murdered. Violence as a form of regulating social relations is tolerated, made banal, feeds racism and sexism, and puts Brazil among the highest global rankings of inequality, homicides, femicides, and incarceration. The second indicator regards the increasing success of police and military figures in the electoral disputes. In 2002, when Lula of the Workers' Party won the presidential election, 660 candidates declared themselves public security professionals, but only 50 of them were elected to state legislatures, the lower house of Congress, and the Senate. In 2018, when Jair Bolsonaro arrived at the presidency, this number jumped to 73. In the municipal elections that concluded yesterday, 8,500 candidates linked to the police and to the armed forces ran for mayor or city council. They registered a record performance, occupying 9.5% of mayorships and 10.2% of city councils. This preamble is important to emphasize what appears to be one of the aspects of the authoritarian and neoconservative way that materialized and gains tractions with Jair Bolsonaro. One expression of this reactionary offensive is the militarization of politics and society in Brazil. That is, the police and the armed forces are gradually occupying spheres of political representation by way of the vote, but not only. Militarization is advancing in a clear reaction to, but also taking advantage of, the consolidation of democracy. The right and the far right have united in Brazil in the name of fighting corruption. They obtained the impeachment of then President Dilma Rousseff in 2016 and broke a cycle of progressive rule that has lasted for 14 years. As put by Renton, conservatives have made alliances with those previously consigned to the margins. Brazil is a good example. The alliance of occasion between the right wing and the far right, which was non-existing during Brazil's phase of redemocratization, brought together those nostalgic for the dictatorship and the hardline members of the military who were opposed to redemocratization. It also attracted a new socially conservative force, evangelical Christians, in frank expansion among lower income brackets and among the low-ranking military. It is at this moment that a political pariah, Jair Bolsonaro, then lawmaker, irrelevant although successful, has stood out, painting himself as a savior figure, leveraging a discourse of hate against the establishment, despite being part of it for almost 3 decades. This false outsider arrived with a nationalist discourse in defense of the homeland against the Reds, identified as the corrupt group that sacked the nation. He preached against the privileges of the elite and spoke in the name of the people, against the values of the left, in short, against communism. Jair Bolsonaro is a former army captain, which alone already assured him an aura of legitimacy, although he had been invited to withdraw from the army for bad behavior. He moved through 8 different political parties, but was unable to create a far-right party with a strategy for building a strong political power. In 2018, months before the presidential election, Bolsonaro switched his party affiliation yet again to a young teeny party, the Social Liberal Party, with a liberal profile. 1 year later, however, Bolsonaro broke with the Social Liberal Party and left the party. At present, he does not have a party, as his attempt to create his own Alliance for Brazil shipwrecked. It needed to obtain around 500,000 signatures and earned not even 10% of that. Bolsonaro's own personal political trajectory and Brazil's authoritarian roots are two entangled dimensions of what has now been called Bolsonarism. It should be understood not as a doctrine, but as an authoritarian form of government whose purpose is to dismantle the democratic institutions that have settled the end of the state of exception and consolidated the rule of law. After 2 years in power, what are the main features of Bolsonarism? Is it a truly fascist regime, or is it kind of a nationalist right-wing populism, well known in Latin America, that reappears every time the region faces one of its many recurrent crises? Before concluding on the best definition of Bolsonarism, let me briefly highlight some of its characteristics to explain what I have dubbed, why I have dubbed this figure an authoritarian with feet of clay. Bolsonaro is the craftsman of chaos. He lives on confrontations, aiming to mobilize reactions to distinguish himself as a leader in the fight against the enemies of the nation. His governance is characterized by the systematic destruction of republic institutions and space of negotiation, turning the state dysfunctional. Bolsonaro has militarized his government. He has a 4-star general as vice president and brought more than 6,000 military figures to the federal executive branch, where they occupy positions previously held by civilians. Of 26 ministers, 11 come from the military. Bolsonaro has a markedly authoritarian style, although he lacks the capacity to implement a ennobling fascist regime, even it might be of his liking. On the contrary to a fascist regime, Bolsonaro not only lacks a party, but has even less ability to impose a single party, which would be practically impossible, given the immense party fragmentation in the country, with 30 parties holding seats in Congress. The size of this fragmentation reveals the impossibility of controlling Congress. The president similarly lacks control of the judiciary. On various occasions, be it official events or street demonstrations, Bolsonaro, his ministers, and his supporters have called for the closure of Congress and the Supreme Court and the jailing of their members for boycotting his government. These rants have led to investigations by the Constitutional Court, leading the president to retreat from his threats. The immense digital activism on social networks that was an important factor in his electoral success was thwarted in a lawsuit against fake news and is now the subject of a sweeping investigation run by the Supreme Court. His family is greatly involved in this lawsuit. Bolsonaro has not been able to muscle the press either, which remains free and independent. He has been opposing academic and research institutions by sharply cutting their budget, but he was unable to overturn the autonomy of universities, a principle inscribed in our Constitution. If one of his pillars is military corporativism, the other one is the defense of traditional family and the Christian faith against gender equality and reproductive rights. Backed by the church, Bolsonaro has launched a remarkably successful crusade against what he calls gender ideology, for it promotes homosexualism and pedophilia. He professes an anti-progressive ideology against diversity, globalism, and multilateralism. He's not committed to any sort of economic nationalism, to the contrary of international far-right leaders such as Modi, Putin, and Orbán, who espouse protectionist measures to defend national interests. The president blindly aligned himself with the Trump government's guidelines and priorities without negotiating counterparts. The economic policies Bolsonaro announced but has not fully enacted, are ultra-liberal and favor slashing public spending, market deregulation, and the privatization of several state-owned companies, particularly the most competitive and performing. His Minister of the Economy, who worked with Milton Friedman in Chile, is radically against the developmentalist approach that prevailed under the Workers' Party in the 2000s and even under the dictatorship back in the 70s, basically because it requires strong state intervention and state controls. Bolsonaro's government advocates a minimal state, not only to comply with fiscal austerity, the neoliberal doxa, but also to avoid corruption, which is inscribed in the state modus operandi for him. Bolsonaro reached the presidency with the strength of 58 million votes. Although his government has confirmed his authoritarian vein, it has also revealed that Bolsonaro is weaker than expected, lacking capacity to control institutions and to preserve the right-wing coalition that took him to power. Although he still has the support of 30% of the electorate, Bolsonaro continues to weaken politically. Proof of this is that the far-right candidates that he openly supported in this year's elections that ended yesterday failed, with the exception of his son, Carlos Bolsonaro. What explains the disastrous performance of the myth, as he's called by his more fanatic supporters? It is due in large part to the mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic, because Bolsonaro repeatedly minimized its gravity and boycotted the good functioning of the public health system, including blocking emergency resources approved by Congress for pandemic response. Denial of the truth, a feature of the contemporary far-right, moral and religious fundamentalism in defense of the patriarchal family, and the militarization of power and politics are the core features of this far-right populist with feet of clay. In this sense, Brazil is unique in that Bolsonaro combines a strong nationalist rhetoric with the defense of a neoliberal orthodoxy. If populism is an ideology oriented towards winning electoral races, as stated by Nude and Kaldwasser, then we can say that Bolsonaro is a far-right populist. He continues to behave as he did when he was running for president. The neoliberal right is clearly looking for an alternative for the post-Bolsonaro era. In the meantime, they will back and take advantage of every liberal reform that this illiberal government may pass in Congress. However, the convergence within the right that brought the far right to power seems to be cracking into pieces today. It falls to the left now and to the progressive forces to reinvent themselves to put forth the narrative that the enemy lies in inequality, racism, and sexism, and that we are all better off in an egalitarian and democratic society. That is the challenge we have for 2022. Maybe there is still time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lavinas. Before I turn to Professor Varshney, I just want to remind everyone that we will have a little bit of time for Q&A after the presentations. And so if you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the tab, the Q&A tab that you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner. Next, we'll turn to Professor Varshney.
Thank you, Paul. I'll be speaking on Modi, India, and democratic politics. And my central argument is here. India's electoral democracy is recognized by democratic theorists worldwide as historically exceptional, especially given its level of income. But India has functioned less well as a liberal democracy. These gaps can be conceptualized as liberal deficits. So that's the overall structure within which I will make the argument about Modi. After Modi's two election victories in 2014 and 2019, and the developments, especially since May 2019, his second victory, India's democratic evolution has reached a stage where the electoral and liberal aspects of democracy are now in deep conflict. India's electoral vibrancy is still not in doubt. I'll give you some data on that. but the liberalism of its polity is in precipitous decline. India is threatening to become an illiberal democracy. The slide may not be irreversible if Modi and BJP do not win the 2024 elections, but if they do, India will become an illiberal democracy. That's the main argument that I'm making. In order for me to proceed further, let me just summarize for the, I think the panelists know this very well, but for the larger audience, some key elements of democratic theory and my argument is anchored in that. So let's just summarize that. There's a minimum requirement according to modern democratic theory, at least in political science, which is electoral. And that goes to Robert Dahl's famous 2 axes or 2 points: contestation, that is to say the incumbent should be contested freely, and participation, that is to say most people, there should be universal franchise, and it should not be too hard it should not be hard for those eligible to vote to actually vote. So those are the 2 axes around which the minimum requirement is satisfied. Then political theory gives us some broader requirements, and it talks about liberal freedoms or civil liberties between elections, especially 3. Liberalism itself has so many varieties, but 3 are common to most varieties of modern liberalism: freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and freedom of association. And I'll apply this to the Indian materials in a moment, but 2 more things that come from modern democratic theory. One is the relationship between income and democracy. And there the conventional wisdom, not challenged by data certainly, is that democracies can be established at any level of income, especially at low levels of income as well, but they survive generally at high levels of income. That is now associated with Adam Przeworski, but it's an older argument. It's more sophisticated in Przeworski's formulation, but it's an older argument. And finally, who votes? Sidney Verba made himself famous for this claim, the empirically anchored claim, that the richer and the more educated the voter, the higher the odds of voting. So against these 4 articles of democratic theory, let's judge India. So the first point is electoral vibrancy. Since 1952, there have been 17 national elections, 375 state elections, and since 1992, 3 million local legislators are also elected every 5 years. 1/3 have to be women by law, at least 1/3 in some states. In some states, it's half by law. It's a state matter, but 1/3 is the minimum that is required. Power has changed hands 8 times in Delhi and tens of times at the state level. Political scientists have stopped counting now how many times power has changed hands at the state level. In 1952, India's first post-independence election, 81 million votes were cast. In 2019, the last national election, nearly 610 million votes were cast. Turnouts are routinely now in excess of 60%. The last 2 elections, 2014, 2019, had record turnouts over 65%. In other words, Modi won 2 most participatory elections in India's history, the 2014 and 2019, in both of which more than 65% of India voted. 60% of eligible voters voted. And then finally, the point that Sidney Verba has made repeatedly, unfortunately deceased a couple of years ago. Until 1989, following mainstream democratic theory, the richer and more educated citizens of India used to vote more than the poorer and the less educated. Since 1989, defying democratic theory, the poor and the less educated have voted as much as, if not more than, their more fortunate co-citizens. There is a plebeian turn in India's democratic evolution over the last 2 to 3 decades. One more point about electoral vibrancy. Even under Modi, the electoral vibrancy of the system remains undiminished. Modi and his party, the BJP, won not only the national elections of 2014 and 2019, widely viewed as free and fair. But what is even more critical for democratic theory, the BJP has lost all state elections except one since its victory in the national elections in May 19, and it also lost many elections some months before the May 2019 elections. The Modi government did not use its power, has not used its power in a constitutionally unauthorized way to annul any of the state elections. Of course, you can argue that the commitment to elections would be tested if Modi were to lose the national elections, which won't happen until 2024. But as far as dealing with losses in elections at the state level is concerned, we don't have any evidence of Modi either interfering in elections or canceling elections if his party loses. And here is from VDEM, India as compared to some other world regions. The line you should see is the red one. This is the Indian line from 1950 till now. In India's record as an electoral democracy, not as a liberal democracy, as an electoral democracy is second only to Western Europe and North America, which is this line, and higher than most other regions of the world. I can say more about it if necessary. I have also broken it down in a recent paper into countries. And there's one country which in the global south, which consistently goes above India, and that's Costa Rica since 1949. But other than Costa Rica, India remains the most surprising democracy in the global south. Okay, now the liberal deficits. There are standard liberal freedoms that are common to all varieties of liberalism, as I briefly argued: freedom of expression, freedom of religious practice, freedom of association. These are typically enshrined in the Constitution and laws, and they lead to the idea of limited government. Government cannot take these things away. And the judiciary, both in legal and political theory, is the final custodian of such freedoms in a democracy. These freedoms are especially important for democracies between elections. Why? And here we can return to Dahl, Robert Dahl, one of perhaps the most influential, perhaps the leading theorist of democracy since the Second World War. Once the thresholds of contestation and participation, the minimal conception, are satisfied, a democracy can attain higher quality, or to use Robert Dahl's own formulation, it can become deeper if liberal freedoms between elections are available. That is, if citizens are free to speak, free to associate, and free to practice their faith. Thus, we cannot have a democracy without free elections, but a democracy would be deeper if non-electoral dimensions of freedom, not simply free vote, were also available. That's the logic for why we value liberal freedoms as Democrats. It just deepens a democracy between elections. Now, as far as liberal freedoms in India are concerned, these three, abridgment of liberal freedoms, especially speech and assembly, are common to all kinds of government. Rushdie's satanic verses were banned under Congress party because of Muslim right. Also under Congress party, M.F. Hussain, a leading painter, had to migrate to the Middle East because of Hindu rights protestation against his paintings of Hindu goddesses. But these problems, and those are just two examples, many, many examples can be given about how India has repeatedly curtailed freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. But these problems become especially serious when Hindu nationalists come to power, as is true today. Why? Minorities, especially Muslims, only 14% of India, automatically get added to the list of targets, not simply writers or artists. A Hindu-centric view of the nation leads to that. India for Hindu nationalists is a Hindu nation, which is a fundamentally unconstitutional idea. The Constitution says every religious community is equal and can practice their faith equally freely. But the Hindu nationalist idea is that India Hindus own the Indian nation, and non-Hindus, about 20% of the country, must accept Hindu primacy of culture, polity, and now that is being translated into laws, as we'll see in a moment. Second, a muscular nationalism threatening to punish dissenters also comes into being that leads to attack on all dissent, not simply dissent emerging from minorities. All dissent begins to get attacked when they come to power, and it's been especially true since the rise of Modi. Under Modi 1, between 2014 and 2019, India saw a new form of communal violence, lynching of Muslims, especially. They were the main target, other groups also, but the data clearly shows that Muslim is the main target. The ostensible aim of lynchings was to prevent beef eating and cattle trading, and to stop young Muslim men from marrying Hindu women, even if their relationships were voluntary. And one can go into what their argument is, that need not detain us here. But the real aim appeared to be clearly teaching Muslims to behave as secondary citizens, not practice their faith freely, not do what use their rights freely and equally, but behave as secondary citizens. Under Modi 2, after 2019, since his return with a larger parliamentary majority, the Hindu nationalist project has acquired a serious legal dimension. BJP's parliamentary numbers now allow the party to underwrite the new legislation, and 3 legislations which have already become law are worthy of consideration, brief consideration, each of these. First, the public safety law that has emerged, which restricts dissent. Second, the citizenship amendment that goes against the Muslims. And third, abrogation of the constitutional status of Kashmir, India's only Muslim majority state. So quickly, here is what the preventive detention does. You have now liberal freedoms in a state of attack. New law passed in August 2019 gives the government power to designate individuals as terrorists and keep them in that state for months before judicial appeal against the terrorist label is permitted. It is essentially preventive detention without legal adjudication for a sufficiently long length of time. It can be used against liberals, leftists, as well as Muslim, and has been used against them. So that's the public safety law against liberal freedoms and against dissent. Second, citizenship amendment. There's a bifocal citizenship move. The first focus is on exclusion of Muslim immigrants as citizens, while accepting all other communities, all of the immigrant communities from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, the 3 neighboring territories, on grounds of persecution. The argument that non-Muslims in these 3 states are persecuted, so they can achieve, if they come to India, they can acquire Indian citizenship, but Muslims from these Muslim majority states will not be accepted as citizens, cannot legally immigrate. And second focus of this move was to promise to introduce a national register of citizens, or registry of citizens, which will deprive all those Muslims who don't have the documents to prove their Indian ancestry or citizenship, even if they were born in India and have lived in the country for decades. It essentially means their disenfranchisement. It doesn't mean millions of detentions. It is not industrial style Nazi detention camps that the Hindu nationalist regime is after. It's simply after disenfranchisement of Muslims, a different kind of target, not military style, not industrial style, a detention of Muslims as non-citizens. Finally, beleaguered Kashmir. India is an asymmetric federation. That's what we call some federations and many federations in political science. And the constitution had given Kashmir, India's only Muslim majority state, special autonomy and powers, following the idea or principles of asymmetric federation. In August 29, via a parliament-approved law, Kashmir lost its status as a state. It is not even a state now, and was brought directly under Delhi's rule. Hundreds of Kashmiri politicians and activists were thrown in jail. In addition, civil liberties were suspended, making citizen protest itself illegal. Only some of these politicians have been released a few months back. They were in jail for a year, and many continue to remain in jail. Now, how much time do you have, Paul? Can I I have two more slides left.
Pretty quickly, you're a little over time.
Okay, so then the last two slides are here. Conclusion number one, if Hindu majoritarianism, pushing itself electorally, goes unchecked, liberal freedoms are more curtailed than before. And if minorities become more beleaguered in the coming years, the longest lasting democracy of the global South will be fundamentally transformed from a substantially liberal democracy to an illiberal majoritarian democracy. And in conceptual terms, this is something I'm writing now, in conceptual terms, it will become like the US democracy before 1965. And the Jim Crow segregation and Jim Crow violence and Jim Crow disenfranchisement of Blacks in the 11 Confederate States of the United States of America, that's a very good analogy for what Muslims might have to go through if this project goes further. Finally, there are 4 possible checks on Hindu nationalist project. Our organizers wanted us to also look at the possible how to reverse the damage that might have been done. In principle, the constitutional check exercised by the court is the biggest potential obstacle to the forward march of Hindu nationalism. How courts interpret their task is now vitally important, but courts are not showing any sign of independence since the second victory of Mr. Modi. In the last almost 2 years, 1.5 years, 1.5 years now, courts have become quite toothless. And not even, for example, examining the habeas corpus cases of the jailed politicians, hundreds of jailed politicians in Kashmir. Not examining the constitutional validity of whether Kashmir status can be taken away by by parliamentary law, whether it requires constitutional amendment. Second, federalism could be another check on Hindu majoritarianism if state elections keep going against the BJP. That is effectively at this point the biggest check on the forward march of Hindu nationalism. Hindu nationalists are not in power in most states of India. Non-violent protests, some of which we saw against citizenship amendment for 3 months, the protests that the pandemic finally killed in March, they went on for 3 months and created real democratic openings in the country. And finally, international opinion, it matters. Mr. Trump visited India. Mr. Trump had nothing to say about the state of human rights or state of democracy in India. He celebrated his friendship with Mr. Modi, addressed 100,000 people in a cricket stadium. But the arrival of Mr. Biden and the statements made by the Secretary of State, as well as Kamala Harris, Vice President, who has Indian heritage, part Indian heritage, so this arrival suggests that there could be some international pressure on Mr. Modi's functioning for the first time in the last 6 years. We still have to see what happens, but Mr. Blinken, the Secretary of State, made a very strong statement in July about the decline of human rights and citizen liberties in India. So let me stop there. Sorry, I took, I think, 2 minutes or 3 minutes more.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Ashu. And finally, Professor Tuğal.
Okay, so most of the public debate focuses on personality traits and personal styles of the authoritarians. And each time a new authoritarian leader emerges, we ask, is she more authoritarian? Is she more dangerous? And I argue this really obscures what distinguishes them from each other. And whenever scholars intervene in these debates, the sociological tendency is to say, hey, look, society matters. We need to look at the demographic brackets who vote for authoritarians. And political scientists study the declining institutions that pave the way for authoritarians. Instead, I argue we need to study whether authoritarian leaders are able to build a stable base that will lock them into power. That base does not pre-exist the authoritarian leader. So if these leaders do not build a social bloc behind them, elections and these allegedly pro-democratic or anti-democratic demographic brackets can swing in any direction based on the conjuncture. So you need to build a bloc. That's the first thing. And the other problem with public debate is that it mostly misses the consent behind the force of the authoritarians and tends to treat these new authoritarians as masters of either naked or manipulative force. And I want to argue against both these takes. So again, when people look at Erdoğan and Trump, the focus is, so I'll talk about this contrast, but I will mostly focus on Erdoğanism. So people mostly focus on their personality traits, their competencies, and neglect the sociological forces. So my account is based on highlighting two elements, not one, of Trump's initial campaign. Yeah, everybody knows about the anti-Mexican, anti-Muslim rhetoric, semi-anti-Black, more ambiguous anti-Black rhetoric, and in application, his enmity against all of these groups in society. But people underemphasized his promise of an infrastructure boom, which he didn't deliver, and which cost him the post-industrial states, which cost him the elections. So the question is, could Trump have delivered on this? And I have written a lot on this, so I won't say a lot, but my argument has been that he wouldn't only need more debt to do this, but he would also need higher taxes, particularly targeted against the rich, to do this. And he did not have the capacity to carry out either of these things. And Steve Bannon, his chief strategist, actively fought for this in his first year, and therefore, before the end of the first Trump year, he was kicked out of office. And the reason for that is because he had not, unlike his Turkish counterparts, he had not built any consent for his war against Mexicans, Muslims, but also the individual capitalists and their short-term interests in the Republican Party and Chamber of Commerce. And we can see the results here, a very clear contrast between Erdoğanism and Trumpism. Erdoğanism from 2002 to 2018, incredible hike in construction spending, whereas under Trump, despite all of this promise of an infrastructure boom, very little happens, very slight tick upward. So why could AKP rule or Erdoğanism fulfill its infrastructural mission? I again argue it's not because of a contrast primarily between the personality traits or competencies of Trump and Erdoğan, but the sociological processes that equip only one of these leaders with the capacity of what I and my colleagues have called political articulation, this capacity to bring together dissimilar discourses, dissimilar groups, dissimilar interests, and then wage war against your rivals. So it's not just, force and violence, it's force and violence backed by consent. And force now against minorities and the poor, but now against individual capitalists if you want to build a long-lasting authoritarian rule. So why did Erdoğanism have this different capacity to build this consent? Well, here I want to highlight three main sociological contrasts between Erdoğan and Trump. Erdoğan comes from within an ideological mass movement, unlike Trump. And second, he is therefore personally equipped. So here is where characteristics come in to play. He is personally equipped with the structured creativeness of a mass ideological leader. Yeah, Trump can be very nimble over Twitter, but this is something different. This is the ability to bring together, meld together really different kinds of people and interests and discursive elements. But it doesn't, this difference or contrast does not remain at this personal level. It is still backed by the organized networks and organizations and intellectuals of Erdoğanism, of the Islamic and then liberal and secondarily fascist movements in Turkey. So whenever they get out of line, Erdoğan pulls them back into line. whenever Erdoğan gets out of line, they threaten him and they pull him back into line. And together, they can wage an uneven war on established interests, which are still in place in Turkey. So the Turkish parts of, the Republican Party or the Chamber of Commerce, but, not to overthrow them, just to keep them in check and under their wing and, well, under their thumb, rather. So how did Erdoğan construct this mass base? Well, I pointed out it's construction. It's the construction sector. These huge mega projects. Trump can talk huge, but he cannot do huge, and Erdoğan can. And together with those mega projects, lots of housing projects. But it was not just construction, it was energy imperialism, which I won't go into, but it was also developmentalist policies in the metal sector. So the things that Trump again promised, I'm gonna bring job backs from China, but could not do. And Erdoğan could do this in the Turkish heartland. He could create these industrial jobs through public-private partnerships. And then there was inclusive neoliberal social policy, the counterparts of which we have seen under the Lula regime, and which Erdoğanism successfully carried out with respect to health, old age, and poverty. And he melded all of these. So he's winning workers, he's winning old people, he's winning over sick people and the disabled, and he's winning poor people, while serving as sometimes the interests of his own country, sometimes the individual interests of the established capitalists, and sometimes solely the long-term interests of capitalists as a class. And none of this means, as I state parenthetically here, none of this means he is not neoliberal. He's mixing all of these with neoliberal populist tools, such as, again, those under the Lula regime, those backed by the World Bank and the UN, things like creating consent through credit and credit card debt, other household debt, mortgages, etc. But these neoliberal populist tools became less and less important in Erdoğan's most authoritarian terms in the 2010s. So this is how we see the results. These heavily public-led and publicly invested public-private partnerships that build housing for millions. TOKİ is the name of Turkey's public housing agency. So it builds these blocks in partnership with private capital, but the public sector paved most of, I shouldn't say most, many of the roads, the sewages, and some of the buildings were also built by this very public agency. So we all know private-public partnerships are very important under especially second phase neoliberalism, but this is beyond that. This is now not just a neoliberal populism with some developmentalism. It is really state capitalism and economic nationalism starting to take over neoliberalism and putting really the market in disciplining the market. So instead of market disciplining the state starts to discipline the market. And then this yet unrealized project, it somewhat correlates with Trump's wall, this huge canal that is going to cut across Istanbul and serve as a second Bosphorus between the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara. It's, again, not realized yet, so it might turn out to be a farce, like Trump's wall, because of post-2018 dynamics, which I might come to later, maybe in the Q&A session, not right now, I'm running out of time. But before this non-realized project, Erdoğan had already built many mega projects, unlike Trump, these huge airports, huge bridges. And unlike Trump, these are not just symbolic and materially only exclusive. They're materially inclusive projects in that they create jobs and housing for millions, while simultaneously they are destroying the livelihoods of millions and also destroying nature. So these aspects of the wall were not even a part of public discussion. Well, you could see some news about them here and there, but no major struggle was waged around the job and housing creating or destroying aspects of the wall, and the rest of Trump's mega projects were never realized. One very important thing about Erdoğanism that is really misunderstood: he's not simply an enemy of labor, as has been said of other neoliberal populists. He is, of course, an enemy of independent labor. He is, of course, an enemy of activist labor, but he is not an enemy of organized labor. In Erdogan's second phase, the 2010s, just in 6 years, the members of the Islamic Union have increased more than threefold. I mean, look at this number, 311% increase. So populism is really misunderstood. It's been defined by Müller and many others as anti-institutionalist, anti-organization. Well, it's not. It builds a successful, thicker populism, not the thin populism of Kasmude, the thick populism of ideologies like Maoism, Peronism, Erdoganism builds mass organization to fight the enemies of the leader. So I can maybe talk later about why all of this started to fail in 2018, but I doubt that it's completely gone. So in sum, what I want to really emphasize is that Erdogan's personal strengths and weaknesses in comparison to Trump are results and not the primary driving force of all of this picture. But once movements and states constitute these leader competencies I have been covering in the case of Erdogan and incompetencies in the case of Trump, these competencies do contribute to the further differentiation of the cases. But the real differentiation is really in the last 40, 50 years, not in the last 4 to 10 years. And the last thing which I have not been really able to come to or highlight is all of this happens within world capitalism, and this is what has set the ultimate limits against Erdoganism. But maybe, again, I can address that in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Cihan. We have 10 minutes, roughly 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do, I got a couple of questions which I'm going to roll into one with a couple of pieces and throw it back to each of you, maybe in the order that you presented, and you can briefly, we probably only have enough time for each of you to talk for 2 more minutes or so, but either respond to the question that I'm going to ask or pick up on anything that came about in this excellent set of presentations that you feel driven to comment on, but we're going to have to be brief because we're going to run out of time. So the question is, what happens next? I'm reminded of, there's a character in a Stoppard play who says, you know, you can stir jam into pudding, but you can't stir it out again, right? So I think the question with all these authoritarian or would-be authoritarian efforts is, can you stir the jam out again? So Ashu, for example, says, well, maybe if you win the 2024 election, but probably not after that, I think I heard him say. Can you stir the jam out, and what kinds of things make it more likely that you would be able to roll back the efforts of a would-be authoritarian? And then the second component of the question is to highlight something that came up in a number of the presentations, which is how important is public opinion in all of this? Does the survival of authoritarian depend on their ability to remain popular with the majority of voters? Or is that something, especially once authoritarian tendencies have developed to a certain point, you can potentially dispense with? So that's a lot to chew on. And maybe there are other things that have come up that you want to chew on in the 2 minutes that each of you have, and we'll start with Kim.
Yeah, thank you. So I think these are, of course, very tough questions. And I think a lot of how things can be undone depends on how they got done, right? So if, as, Ashutosh tells us that, India is still an electoral competitive democracy and they're still opposing political parties and so on. I mean, if the authoritarianism is ideological, right? It's toxic ideology. If the structures remain intact, then presumably, there's a battle for the hearts and souls of people, and you can, hopefully run an election and have somebody else win. The cases that I'm concerned about are the cases where you can't do that anymore, precisely because once somebody's come to power, they've deconstructed all of the levers through which you could change power. And what you see happening, and I get a little worried this is happening in the US, but it certainly happened in Hungary, that Orbán keeps winning bigger and bigger parliamentary majorities with smaller and smaller actual publics voting for him, right? And once you're in that dynamic, then you really need something to come in to break it apart from the outside. I mean, either a popular uprising from the inside or something from the outside. And so, in some cases, like with Hungary and I think with Poland, we're trying to get the EU to come in and leverage the fact that they're paying a lot of money for these regimes to try to close them down, but you don't have regional, organizations in large parts of the world that can do that, and they're not accustomed to it. So I think we need to build new structures to undo it, is the short answer.
Lena?
Oh, this is a tough exercise, 10 minutes, the 2 seconds. So anyway, I think that it's important to understand, at least in Latin America, I think there are lots of difference between what Kim presented on Hungary and Brazil, or what Cihan presented on Erdogan, radically different, because Bolsonaro is completely unable to deliver anything so far. But in 2018, when Bolsonaro was elected, only 9% of Brazilians, according to the Latino Barometro, were happy with democracy. Because, of course, people have associated democracy with corruption, with a strong state, with, let's say, privileges. For instance, last year, the only achievement of Bolsonaro government was to pass pension reform. And the argument was, let's crash down the privileges. So, but who's privileged? Because 65% of pensions in Brazil correspond to one minimum wage. It's $200. So you see, people don't understand what is going on. But I think the big problem is that people, they really move away from politics. And in Brazil, where vote is mandatory, there is a huge abstention trend now since 2018. In 2018, people who voted against Bolsonaro and abstentions were higher than the votes for Bolsonaro. So this is important to understand, that we have to revalue politics, we have to reinvent politics, and it's extremely difficult, but this is the point. Either we are unable to really create something that is exciting, that brings people back, and that guarantees political participation. People don't just want to come and just put their ballot during the election time. People want something different. So I think it's important to reinvent not only democracy, but political participation. And unfortunately, the left in Brazil continues to be disunited, and I'm not sure we'll be able to do that in 2 or 3 years' time. Thank you.
Yeah. So public opinion, Paul, is a very important issue here. Mr. Modi is the most popular leader of India. There is no comparison. And a lot of his power derives from both inside his party. His party has become basically his party rather than his party historically did not have one particular figure dominating the party so much. So it's in that sense, it's more like Trump, Mr. Modi's capture of the party, but it's also unlike Trump in that he comes from an ideological mass movement, is more like Erdogan, comes from the Hindu nationalist movement, has been with the party and its mother organization. He started there for almost 50 years. Almost, he's 74, I think 73. More than that, he joined the organization when he was 18, 19, 20, something like that, maybe, and has not left that organization and has participated in the networks that Cihan talked about, the networks that are available to him. Now, what happens next? And on this, I think Kim rightly identified my claim that the institutions of democracy have not been, to use her term, have not been crashed. There isn't the Constitution is not crashed, right? The Supreme Court, but their meaning is being transfigured. He wants an obedient court. He wants a court, Supreme Court, but an obedient court. He wants an obedient press. He wants an obedient central bank. So independence of institutions is what he's against, not dismantling those institutions altogether. Independence of institutions. And all these should become his handmaidens. That seems to be what's happening. Now, clearly, this process can be reversed if he loses the 2024 election, which is more than 3 years away, 3.5 years away. If he does not lose the 2024 elections, he wins again, then India, while these institutions might remain, their meaning will be transformed to such an extent that they would not be serving their appointed functions. They'll be serving the functions that Modi wants them to serve. And that's why ultimate check on that, there could be other small, as I said, federalism is a check, as I said, international opinion can be checked, but the ultimate check is going to be a big national electoral reversal. Until that happens, Mr. Modi's power can continue to grow, or remain as it is, if not grow.
Thank you. Finally, Cihan.
Yeah, I think I would agree with the other panelists in that I think there is still time in India and Brazil, and even Trump or somebody similar gets elected in 2024 in the US, there would still be a chance of reversal. But once it is entrenched, so going back to Paul's question, once it's entrenched, I think it's very difficult to undo. And going back to Wayne's typed question, that you can even enact a mass uprising against the dictator. Millions of people in the streets for weeks in Turkey. And nothing shakes, or barely shakes, because there are entrenched interests now behind the dictatorship. People are benefiting in multiple ways. Honor, income, safety, lots of things. It's very hard to undo that unless you can promise something better. And that's very difficult to do when you're living under a dictatorship. So once it's entrenched, and I would say this less for the US, but for countries like Turkey, Brazil, once it is entrenched, probably the flow of global money is more of a threat than uprisings or other things. So because of all of that, I'm most worried about India, actually. If Modi sticks to neoliberalism, yeah, I'm less worried. But if he starts to mix economic nationalism and state capitalism with neoliberalism, then it might really go the Erdoganist direction, and that would be a nightmare.
Great, thank you all. I wish we had another hour. I think all these are marvelous presentations, and both the similarities and differences across this set of cases, and we could throw the US sadly into the mix as well. I think just make for a really fascinating conversation. So thank you for starting it for us. Thank you to everyone at Matrix for making this discussion possible. Thank you to everyone who participated and sent us questions, and we look forward to the next opportunity.